Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Ken Goldberg, who is an artist and professor of engineering at UC Berkeley. Ken, welcome back to our program.
Thank you very much, Harry.
You are an artist and an engineer. Kind of an unusual combination, isn't it?
Well, I tend to think of myself as kind of a hybrid. So I've always been torn between those two interests, and I've been lucky. Here at Berkeley, they're very tolerant. They let me sort of pursue both of them. And
what is the interface between these two topics? You are a scientist and an artist. What is your theory of how the two subjects sort of interface and work together?
Well, you know, going back to C.P. Snow in 1959, wrote this essay about the two cultures. And he was really pointing out something that persists today, that I like to refer back to the etymology, that the word science is a Greek word that comes from scindere, which is to cut, and art is a Latin word that comes from ars, which is to join. So it's not surprising that these two fields, these two modes of inquiry are complementary. But interestingly, they often don't really connect. And there's a real misunderstandings between the two. And we see this every day on campuses or in culture at large. And it's still true here at Berkeley, although I think Berkeley is exemplary for many reasons we can talk about. But in my head, what I find is that what they share is a real interest in creativity and innovation. So in both art and science, if you do something really brilliant, but it's been done before, it's not that interesting. What you have to do is something that's really new. And that looking, that instinct about finding something, understanding why it might be new, and then being able to pursue it, those are very similar between the two. But interestingly, the cultures, the personalities, the temperaments are very different.
In an early exhibit that you did, you wrote an introduction, which I quoted actually in our last interview, but I want to go back to it. You say media technology generally facilitates the suspension of disbelief. I am trying to facilitate the resumption of disbelief. You still believe that?
Yes. At that time, I was particularly interested in skepticism and the idea that it's very important to remain skeptical. And I think that at that time, the internet was just beginning, and we were very interested in how it could rejuvenate a kind of sense of doubt in culture. Now, 10 years later, I think that is still very, that we do have that sense of doubt. It has had to some degree that effect. But I'm still interested in the idea of asking questions, of really trying to probe and continually challenge our assumptions and authorities around us.
And there's a link here, because science is about questioning and posing the right question, keep asking the question of your own research and of other people's research, and that's what art is about too, isn't it?
Absolutely. No, interestingly, both of them also have a quality where you often start off in one direction, and if you're open, you'll wind up somewhere very different. That you have to be, in a way, you start out with these intentions, whether you're making a film or an art installation or starting on a research project, and two years later you might find yourself in a very different place. And that's also fascinating to me, how you're open to what you learn on the way.
Now, as an engineer, would you explain to our audience what generally you do? You work at figuring out ways that robots can be used. That's my oversimplification. Okay. So give us a kind of insights into your work as an engineer.
So my background is in robotics, and in particular, I look at the geometry of robot manipulation. So I'm very interested in, for example, how when you hold a cup, how you should place your fingers so as to make sure that the cup won't fall, won't slip. And I look at that in the context of manufacturing. There's in fixture design, and part feeding, things like that. And I'm also interested in another area called motion planning, which is similar, which is how do you move around and avoid obstacles? And especially I'm interested in cases where there are restrictions on the motions you can make. For example, a car, you can't just go sideways. So you end up with strange solutions like parallel parking, which is counterintuitive. We're looking at some things like that applied in the context of surgery right now. And for example, steering needles through the body. So there's a host of different problems that are all associated with geometry and motion that I'm very interested in, especially in the context of uncertainty, and today more and more in probabilistic models.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about these medical applications. Is the social goal here to increase the efficiency and lower the costs of surgical procedure?
Well, yes, partly. One is we're not going to replace human surgeons anytime soon. That's where I'm very skeptical. I don't think we're going to. The surgeons is a very complex task to perform a surgery. What I think, though, that we can do is assist surgeons by providing some help with some of the subtasks that provide a kind of tedium for them, and essentially take away their attention from the important decisions they need to make in other times. So, for example, there are parts of retraction and resection and suturing that we believe we can train a robot to be able to assist in those subtasks. And we're very interested in, to do this, we have to model the human body, but also the new area that's very exciting right now in robotics is robot learning. And that is what? By observing the motions or the actions of humans, especially human experts, like expert surgeons, we can essentially model what they're doing and then use that to build a control policy for a robot.
Mm-hmm. And this obviously would have implications for certain type of cancers and the deliveries of medicines and so on?
Right. So there's two areas I'm interested in. One is on the actual suturing and these kind of subtask motions. We call computer-assisted or robot-assisted surgery. And then the other is in inserting treatments, whether it's chemotherapies or particularly radiation therapies, into targeted tumors inside the body. So we're looking at the prostate with a group at UCSF. And we've developed something we just got a patent for with Johns Hopkins called steerable needles. And here the idea is that we take advantage of the asymmetry at the tip of a needle. So when you push a needle into a stiff tissue, it won't go straight. It will curve slightly and follow a circular trajectory. So what we do is we use that so that as you push the needle in, it curves. Then you twist it at the base, and it follows a different path. And there you can allow that to go around sensitive organs, nerve bundles, bones, and come in and reach a desired tumor. So this comes back to the parallel parking. This is almost like parallel parking in 3D. So those are the kind of things we're interested in as the delivery problem. We now know how to image the body much better, but we still are challenged by how do we now deliver the treatments to what we're seeing in those images.
And how will you map that in the future? Is it by watching doctors do this, hiring doctors as consultants to sort of help you understand the terrain and so on?
Well, so in the two parts, and I should be careful to distinguish. In the first one, where we're learning from robots, we're learning from human experts. We're applying techniques that actually my colleague here at Berkeley, Peter Abiel, has pioneered, where he's been using them to fly helicopters and do amazing acrobatic stunt maneuvers that only a few humans in the world can do.
Robots, yeah.
He's trained robots by basically using the trajectories and the data that comes from human experts to infer the trajectories for the robot. We're doing something now, we're working together to apply this to surgical subtasks. And so here we're working also with a world-class leading physician from UC Davis, Doug Boyd, and he's helping us to basically teleoperate the robot. We're learning his trajectories, and then we're applying techniques from control theory, like Kalman smoothing, to infer what he's doing, that in a way that's even more subtle that he can't explain, but he can show us, he can demonstrate what he's doing. Mm-hmm. In the delivery problem with the prostate, those are problems where it's not so much about watching what surgeons do, although we work closely with them, but there it's pure geometry. We're really trying to understand what are the constraints in the body, how do deformations work, and what are the constraints in the needle, and then be able to apply purely algorithmic techniques to find the best path to reach a target.
Now the implications of this just sound applicable to whole sorts of areas. Hazardous environments like Japan, robots going in to deal with the situation there, the recent pipeline explosions in the Bay Area, sort of inspecting pipelines and so on. Am I right about that? I mean, it's obviously not your work, but that's where this all can go. Well,
one of the things, I've actually been interested to see where robots would be used in the Fukushima plant. For example, that in Japan is very advanced in robotics. They have lots and lots of, they've poured huge amounts of research funding into that field, and there's a lot of great researchers there. So I've been expecting that we would see robots saving the day to some degree. Mm-hmm. But interestingly, there's been very little reporting on that topic. I suspect that they've sent in robotic unmanned aerial vehicles to peer down into those structures, and I think they've seen things they don't want to report.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about where this goes in the military realm. You talked about watching helicopters and figuring out how robots might fly them. Now, what immediately comes to mind is the use of drones in the Afghan-Pakistan war to avoid the loss of American life. And interestingly enough, there's a story in yesterday's LA Times about a great error made by the American military in taking out a convoy, which they thought was Taliban, mm-hmm. Remote controlling the operation from Nevada. And in fact, they targeted the wrong group because it was women, children, and some businessmen heading in a convoy to the city. So the question is, do engineers, not artists, because we'll talk about that in a minute, but do engineers think about the possible negative implications of where this technology is taking us?
Well, I think they should. It's very important. You're absolutely right. I mean, the robots are extremely prone to failure. We know this. I mean, that's part of what that makes the field so complex and essentially it's moved slowly, because you can have lots and lots of successes, but you have one or two failures and it could be catastrophic. So we are very aware of this. I think that the drones, I mean, this is really a long trajectory, if you will, of essentially trying to stay as far away from the enemy as possible. So from the first rock that was thrown, to the catapult, to gunpowder, the whole, if you look at all the evolution of the military, it is trying to keep further and further of a distance between yourself and the danger. And so the drones, I think, are very interesting in that regard, because it is a natural evolution. And yes, they make mistakes there, but so do manned vehicles, as we know. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. I do wonder what this world is going to look like later when both sides have robotic techniques and the robots are essentially in conflict and in battle. I mean, it would be nice to be able to leave all of our sons and daughters at home and let the robots figure out who should win on the battlefield.
Mm-hmm. Now, in this role as an artist, that also for you comes with taking the philosophy of all of this into account. And I know you've taught a course here on the Berkeley campus with Hubert Dreyfus, trying to think of the implications of technology for mankind and womankind. So I guess the question is, help us understand what telepresence is and what some of the moral issues are that you've been trying to work with in this course.
So I have to say one of the great privileges is to being at Berkeley is that opportunity to work with someone like Bert Dreyfus. And since I arrived here 15 years ago, we've had an ongoing friendship and professional relationship. And so we've had the chance to teach 2 courses. Most recently, it was a course on the philosophy of technology. And I learned immensely from him. One of the texts that we studied most closely was Heidegger's Question Concerning Technology. And Dreyfus helped me and the class, as we did a reading of that text, to understand what Heidegger was saying was a model. Heidegger said the essence of technology is nothing technological. And what he meant by that was that it's not about the machinery, the robots, the specific gears, motors, etc. That's, if you're just looking at that, you're missing a point. He says ultimately it boils down to that technology is a way of approaching the world, approaching the natural world, that it wants to transform it into something that's more and more available, into resources. So rather than seeing, let's say, a river as a primitive would, as something almost magical, or as something that has imbued with some kind of its natural beauty and appreciation of all those things, that contemporary society tends to view the river as something that could be harnessed to make power. And when we make power, then it can be used for all kinds of different other purposes. So we're essentially seeing it not as its individuality, but as something general and a nice resource. And then we start seeing a lot of the world that way. And Heidegger was very concerned about that trend, that we were not only making the world more and more efficient, but we were transforming it into this more and more availability for its future potential. And that he said that the most compelling technologies of the future would be those that are most flexible. So in a way, if you think about what this was 50 years ago, he's right. The technologies that are most exciting are the computer, the network, nanotechnology, stem cells, robotics. These are all things that don't just do one thing, but they can do many different things. And that flexibility, that ability to be resources, is something that's very, very compelling. What Heidegger, the next step was that he warned that if this were carried further, that we would apply this to ourselves. And we would start to see ourselves as resources. And we would seek to make ourselves more and more available. And that, I think, is a prediction of exactly what's happening today with the new technologies of cell phones and social media.
So we can't turn them off. We can't, we're constantly being inundated with data. At some might say, at a certain point, at the cost of our humanity, of our family, of our human interaction. Is that the possible implication? That's
one of the fears, right? That we're going to be overwhelmed, that we feel that we are resources, that we are just going to make ourselves constantly available. I think there are strategies to resist. In fact, my wife and I, Tiffany and I, have been, over the last 4 weeks, we've been trying to do a Shabbat, to really follow the idea of a Sabbath, and to take from sundown Friday night to sundown Saturday, and we turn off the cell phones, and no screens. We drive, but we really try to unplug. And the result has been really fascinating.
In what sense?
Well, first of all, the day seems to last 4 times as long. I mean, it's amazing. I have to say, I was a little skeptical because I'm always behind on email like everyone. It's a hard habit to give up. And when we started it, I thought, oh, I'm gonna get so stressed out. But the opposite happens. And I'll ask, what time is it? And first of all, we have to look around for a clock because you realize clocks are very rare nowadays. You usually look at your phone, and if you don't have that. But then, you typically, it's 10 in the morning, and it feels like a day has gone by. And then it's 11, and it's 2, and you just feel like you've suddenly, this day goes on and on. Not in a boring way, but actually in a much more rich and satisfying way. And so by Sunday morning, when I wake up and get back in, or Saturday night, you just feel incredibly rejuvenated. And I think, I might be wrong, but I think I could do more work on that 3-hour Sunday after the rest than I could if I had worked straight through.
Mm-hmm. Now, this raises an interesting question because, and we've talked about what robots can do and the possible liabilities weighed against the good that they can do. And one aspect of your work that interests me as an artist is to do projects that essentially look at where a culture or subculture is and ask or answer questions. And I have 2 things in mind here. One is you and Tiffany did a movie called The Tribe, which tries to answer the question, what is Jewish identity in modern times? Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you now have a project just opening an exhibit at the Jewish Museum in San Francisco, which is trying to use technology to bring out an aspect of Jewish culture, which is to constantly be asking questions. So what intrigues me here is that you seem to be focused as an artist in one aspect of that career in rejuvenating the values that in a traditional religion, in your case, offers to a particular people. Talk a little about that, because that seems to be an important trajectory in your life's work.
Well, thanks for asking that. And as we talk about questions, Harry, it's very interesting because that's what you do. I mean, you are a professional inquirer. Right? And asking a good question is a really difficult and complex, subtle thing. I mean, I try and teach this in classes. And we have a course called Questioning New Media. And it's one of the hardest things. Students can be very, very good. They can get into the top schools, but learning very well how to answer questions, but not knowing how to ask them. And as you know, that's an art that really is in some ways more challenging than answering. And I also think that the idea, even the very idea of answering a question is we have to question that, because an answer always presupposes has a singularity to it. But oftentimes there's multiple answers, and we have to be ready when we answer to also turn around and ask another question, to be able to think about what does that open up, what does one question lead to the next question. So in the context for me, it has been an interesting path for me to think back about my origins and my background culturally as being Jewish, because I grew up in a steel town in Pennsylvania. It was Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which is called the Christmas City, USA. There were about 2 Jewish kids in my high school, my parents took me to synagogue, but it wasn't we weren't religious or observant. But later, as I started thinking about these ideas later in life, I found their values start to come back to me. And so, as you mentioned, the film The Tribe that Tiffany and I worked on in 2006 was a way of starting to re-explore this identity and think about it in sort of what was our generation, how were we responding. And we thought about, we used the Barbie doll as a sort of mechanism to talk about pop culture and how Judaism has evolved, and that it was very resilient and it had taken many different forms. But at its core, Judaism was all about being an outsider. And once you understood that, you started to see how it was appealing and how it had developed all these different strategies and forms and multiple answers to lots of questions. Now, in the new project, I'm very interested in specifically in questions, and it started with the Jewish Museum coming to me and also my collaborator Gil Gershoni and saying, we have this piece of architecture called the Yud. It was designed by Daniel Libeskind, and it's really complex. People talk about Rubik's Cube. I call this Libeskind's Cube, because it's a cubical structure
Within the museum.
Within the museum, the
yeah.
top floor. And it is about 60 feet high, about 60 feet long, all white, with no parallel walls. And Libeskind said there should be no representational art in this space. That's a big problem for an art museum. And it also, so the idea is to naturally put sound in there. But it turns out acoustically, it's a nightmare. The sound is constantly bouncing, and we've had professional acousticians in there, and they say, this is terrible space. I mean, this is... So what do we do? So we took that as a challenge, and we developed a sound piece that we worked with Myers Sound. These are the guys here in Emeryville who make the best sound systems in the world, Beijing Olympics, Cirque du Soleil. And then we used cameras to, and this is where the robotics comes in, we watch, the cameras observe as someone moves in the room and how they move, and then shapes the soundscape to their movements. And the sounds are questions that we have culled down from thousands of questions that were asked through social media. We edited those, and then we had them recorded. And so then we create this soundscape that's all about asking rhetorical questions. James Baldwin has a quote that we like: "The purpose of art is to lay bare the questions that have been hidden by the answers."
Very good, very good. So then what you're doing is you're bringing the technology to an engineering problem, which is this particular structure within the structure, and coming up with an exhibit that in essence helps answer the question, well, what has it meant to be a part of the Jewish faith on the one hand, and then how is that evolving into the future as we continue to ask questions and ask different questions?
Right. So one of the things that you're getting at is how is it Jewish? And we like there's a classic joke, which is, the man goes to the rabbi and he says, "Why is it that Jews always answer a question with a question?" And the rabbi says, "Do we?" And I love it because it's a very interesting glimpse into the idea that the rabbi is open to discovering something new about his own tradition, right, from this stranger. And at the same time, it's a welcoming of a question, that a question is an opportunity to look at something new. The rabbi is not just expected to churn out answers, but a rabbi is expected to take in a question and then think about it, and maybe see where that's going to go. And that's very much of a Talmudic tradition. When Jewish kids are Jewish, they ask the 4 questions, which is nice because the Passover holiday is going to be in 2 weeks, and so this show opens right at the same time, same month. So we're interested in its intersection with Jewish culture, and a lot of the questions that are in the exhibition come from Jewish sources, literature and the Bible and the Talmud. But we also want to be very conscious that this is not exclusively Jewish, that this is actually part of many traditions. And so we want to reinvigorate the idea of questions for everyone, that we think it's really important. And the don't ask, don't tell policy, which has been fortunately repealed recently, in the military is still pervasive in many other areas about economics and about foreign policy and many different things where we're told, listen, this is not, don't worry, it's too complicated, don't ask about this. But I think we need to be.
It could be argued that moving away from these exhibits, but to the impact of these technologies generally, that in a way they have a dual potential. On the one hand, they can make institutions more legitimate as they ask questions to their constituents about what should we be doing, how we could change. But on the other hand, too much information can lead to a delegitimation of the institution, and we no longer believe in anything. So let's look at some of the work you've done in policy areas, because I know that you've designed a site for the State Department. Tell us what you did there and what was that about, and what was the goal?
Okay, so this started as an exploration of social media. And my students and I were very interested in a particular sub-area called collaborative filtering, or recommendation systems. And if you've used Netflix or Amazon, you know how it recommends a book or a movie to you? So we've been doing some work in that area. And the connection with robotics is that we do it by using geometric algorithms. So that's why we think of the data in a spatial form, and that allows us to develop some algorithms that are faster than the ones that are out there. So we have a patent and several publications. Very recently, about 2 years ago, we realized that we could actually use the algorithm that we were working on to create a visualization for anyone on the internet to be able to see where they stood with respect to other people, not in terms of their geography, where they lived, but in terms of their opinions. And it works like this. You come into a website and you're asked 5 questions about their statements, and you're asked to indicate to what degree you agree or disagree with each statement. And so you move a slider for each one of them. And this defines a point in a 5-dimensional space. And then we use techniques known as dimensionality reduction to project you down into a 2-dimensional space. And now all of a sudden you can see where you are with respect to everyone else. You see, first of all, that you're not alone, that there's a group of people who agree with you, but more importantly, that not everyone agrees with you. So there's a vast spectrum out there of different viewpoints. And then where it gets interesting for us is that you can now express yourself in that context, and you answer discussion questions. In the case of the State Department, who we started partnering with shortly after Obama was elected, they asked us to develop a version of this for them that would basically collect input from constituents anywhere in the world. So they did not have to be US citizens. Anyone on the internet could come in and express opinions and suggest ideas. And Hillary Clinton was very open to this, which is really remarkable. If you think about the State Department, it's a very old institution, and I know you've had many people from diplomacy and politics, in conversation. There's a lot of tradition, there's a lot of conventional wisdom, et cetera. But Hillary Clinton was open to saying, let's hear what the public has to say about this. So, and of course, if you just throw open the doors and you say everybody can post on my wall and submit, you'll get a lot of very distracting comments. And this, by the way, is true for any comment list right now. So the New York Times and the Washington Post are struggling with this because every time they post an article, the kind of comments they get can be really disparaging and distracting. Mm-hmm. So they're trying to figure out ways to work with that.
So you're biasing or skewing the responses in one direction depending on what the technological base is for taking in the information.
Well, yeah, because one of the things is a list is a very bad structure for managing large amounts of data. Right? It's linear. You have to walk down the list. So the example is Zuckerberg from Facebook posted something about the new policy on privacy on Facebook, and he got 35,000 responses. And it said, you could read them, but who's going to read 30? We calculated it would take 8 days. So we're trying to figure out better tools. Yeah. So this tool is one that uses visualization, and you can see everybody who's responded at a glance. But then what it does is it uses social media and the wisdom of crowds because everybody reads and rates each other's comments. And so then we have formulas for basically taking the set of ratings and factoring in spatial distances and probabilistic confidences to come up with a score for each comment, and then its size in the representation, the size of the point, grows with respect to how positive its reputation is. So if you want to see the most popular comments, it's very easy to find them. And they're rated not just in terms of how much you agree, in this case, Harry, but also in terms of how insightful the comment is. Mm-hmm. And that's something we're really interested in, is can we call out the insightful comments? And the characteristic of an insightful comment, and in some ways this comes back to the point you made about art and science, what characterizes an insight is that you may disagree with an insight, but you have to say that it adds something new to the conversation. That's what insight is. It gives you a new sight, a new visual, a new new way of looking at a problem. So we're interested in things where you rate something and say, I don't agree, but I do think it's insightful. And those kind of comments really are part of the thing that pushes the conversation forward. So that's what the system is designed to look for. And
importantly, these differences are mapped on a screen, so that you presumably can find these insightful ideas in some little corner, but there's an opportunity to explore them and see that they're there.
Right. So everyone has a chance. One of the things that's very important is, currently the way the State Department has a blog, and it's monitored, and that means that they reject a fair number of the submissions for a variety of reasons, and it's hard to know. And so you only see the tip of the iceberg. And this is true, by the way, in the letters to the editor and many other forums where it's heavily monitored. But we believe that the alternative is you let everybody in, so anyone can come in and see. Even the most minute and disagreeable comment is still in the system. So everyone has a voice, but you also let the participants, the community, essentially also rate each other, and so that they can, as a group, identify those things that are of most insight, most value.
Now, this raises an interesting question about the implications of what is involved in all of this, and that is, in this particular case, it's the State Department and a leader, Hillary Clinton, who's willing to be open to the uses that this technology could be made of. But in different systems could incorporate technology like this and use it for devious or, not very positive ends. One could think here of the Egyptian security services, in the Mubarak period. So how do you, or does an engineer think about these kinds of implications, or is it only the artist who happens to be an engineer who worries about this?
Well, I completely agree with the point you're making, which is that there are these moral and ethical implications of these technologies. Melvin Kranzberg has a quote: "Technology is neither good, nor bad, nor neutral." And I love it because I think it's exactly right. We have to have our eyes open. And you're right. The technique, some of these techniques might give people a false confidence that something is allowing them to speak clearly, and then ultimately would reveal their identities. And so, for example, in the State Department, we go to great lengths to avoid any, there's nothing identifiable when you log into the system. In fact, even your IP address, all the things that most websites collect, and as a matter of course, we suppress all of that because it's actually, they've asked us to not collect anything. The reason, now of course that also means that as you have more and more anonymity, it tends to lead toward more and more extreme statements and viewpoints because people aren't bound by their identity. So they'll say, they'll tend to say things that are really contentious and disparaging of others. So that's why the system is set up to essentially diffuse that, because what it says is if you want to say something really disparaging, fine, but overall the wisdom of crowds won't reinforce that. So what we're looking for is essentially just the principles of democracy, is how does a group essentially work together and tend to resolve disagreement, and so that an extreme position that may be very, very negative won't be allowed to dominate the discussion. But at the same time, I will never claim, and I think anyone who does would be, I would be very suspicious of, I would never claim that any of these technologies are immune from abuse. So
in the worst case, these technologies could be abused by an authoritarian regime. But on the other hand, these technologies clearly can be used to change systems, revolutions. Here, we've just witnessed all these revolutions, or ongoing processes of change in the Middle East, using Facebook, using Twitter. And then the most extreme case, something like WikiLeaks, which the Obama administration, which supported your project on the one hand, is trying to suppress on the other hand the WikiLeaks phenomena. So I guess the interesting question is, how do we navigate these extremes?
Great point. I mean, you're absolutely right. The Hillary Clinton and Obama, the administration as a whole has been champion of new technologies like Twitter and social media, and they were caught in a very delicate position by the exposure of the WikiLeaks and the cables. The term that they used is that they were against radical transparency, and which is where everything is exposed. And I think there's something to this point. I'm not in favor of radical transparency. I don't think that everything should be done in public. I don't think it's good for creativity. I think that as an artist, as a scientist, I need privacy. I need to be able to go off and make mistakes and try things out, and et cetera. And if I was living in a glass house where everything was being scrutinized, I think it would be hard to continue to try new things. I think also that in the case of diplomacy, and as we know, so many things, there's so many subtleties that have to go on. And I respect that process, that you do need to have a certain ability to keep some things private. And yet, I do think that at the same time, accountability is important. So the idea of openness is very important, but it's different than transparency, where everything is instantly available. So I think the WikiLeaks played a very important, and I think many people in the administration would agree that it actually played a really important role to make us think about these issues. I think it woke a number of people up that they were not being very smart about the security precautions. Also starting to realize that in this world that it was fairly easy to take a disk with 1 million cables on it and hand it over to somebody. I don't think people quite realized that potential. So it had a positive benefit. Remember, of course, Assange did not release everything. He was responsible, right? There were some things in there that were too sensitive, and he did not. And I think that at the same time, it's a very interesting cautionary tale that we are living in an age where a lot of our what we think is going to be private is not. And we have to have our eyes open to what that's going to be. And I would say that technologies may be able to help us, in the sense that, can they help us to manage all of these sources of information? And we know now that we can use passwords and encryption, and there's certain things that we can actually use to give us degrees of privacy, for our credit cards and et cetera. So technology has helped in one regard, and at the same time, we also have to know that there is a dark side, that major companies and governments know far more about us than they did in the past because they have access to our email.
I was at a conference, the Logan Symposium on Investigative Reporting over the weekend, and freelance journalist Davies from The Guardian was explaining how they developed this idea of WikiLeaks working with the press to essentially filter the documents, eliminate names of people whose lives might be threatened, and so on. The reason I raise this is that it seems to me that part of the issues that you're struggling with is to ask yourself and your community, what are the values and standards that you will bring to these engineering projects, so that we will bring them on board, so to speak, in an environment where we kind of retain whatever moral values, our civilization or our religion or whatever has used in the past. So it's kind of intriguing because as we're confronting things like WikiLeaks, the revolutions in the Middle East, we have to ask, how far do we go with this? Does it lead to some kind of anarchy? Talk a little about that, because that seems to be implicit in a number of your projects. You're suggesting that as an engineer, you think about it, but you also seem to be in some of these installations trying to figure out, how you say, well, my religion or your religion is still important because it makes us think ethically about the human implications of the technology.
Well, you're right. I mean, what you're getting at is there are these, on one hand, what seem to be contradictions, right? And I think I do think about this when you asked about being an artist and an engineer. I don't think of myself as having merged them in any sense. I think of them as as two very different things. It's almost like the Gestalt. You see the glass, and then you see the two faces. I find in my head, when I'm starting to think as an artist, it's a different part of my brain is activates, and then when I come back to being an engineer, it flips. But going back and forth, I find somehow very there's something that works for me about being able to do that, and I realize that there's contradictions. I like the word complementarity. That I see them as not opposite, but in some way both two structures, way of looking at the same thing, but from two different perspectives at the same time. And I find that endlessly interesting, is to be able to take some topic and think about it from both of those two perspectives and try and wrestle back and forth between them, trying to understand what's going on. Not that it's going to be resolved. I think that, coming back to our earlier point, one question leads to another. So these two things, there's a dynamic tension. They go back and forth with each other. And I find that leads to oftentimes some new set of questions that haven't been addressed either from engineering point of view or by artists in the past. And that's when I start to, opens up the possibility of doing something new.
But how does society control this? And I guess here suddenly what comes to my mind is, let's look at the problem of the military drones and the extent to which we've created a world of video games that teach our young people about the suspending their belief in your terms, as they play their games. Then they come into a world and they enter the military, and you suddenly have people at screens in Nevada ordering, attacks on convoys in Afghanistan. And here, the young people who have become soldiers are well-intentioned. But they, because of errors in the technology, miscommunication, and so on, kind of bad things happen. I guess what I'm curious about is, as an educator, what do we need to do to get more people weighing these contradictions that you've raised, that you think about personally as an engineer, but we're dealing with technologies that will be used by a broad audience that aren't engineers necessarily.
Right. Well, I think, the idea, we always, when we catch ourselves, I think, saying, this new technology is going to really do some damage to young people's minds. I mean, I remember being told that by my grandmother, you got to turn off that TV, it's going to rot your mind. And there was a lot of fear that the TV was going to have this terrible effect, and we were, and in fact, it was said that when books emerged, that we were going to lose our memory. I mean, to some degree, those things have happened, but we've developed new capabilities that were positive as a result. I don't think we'll be able to turn them off, and I think we should really be, as you're suggesting, thoughtful about how they're going to be how they can, what they're going to open up, and what are the new capabilities. I mean, I think that, for example, the ability of young students now to multitask is something that I personally cannot quite grasp. It seems very, the idea of sitting down or being at a lecture with your laptop open seems wrong to me, and I can't really do it. I mean, the few times I do it, I get absorbed and I don't really pay attention to the lecture. But they seem to have a capability of doing this, and I'm really interested in trying to understand how they do it. How someone can monitor Twitter and tweet during the actual lecture and can be really insightful and share notes among a lot of different people at the same time. It's a new world. And so I'm hopeful. At the same time as I think that there are certainly things that we have to be cautious about, I do think that the history of technology has led to many, many breakthroughs and advances and abilities to expand our world and our environments and our horizons. And it's cured a number of ailments and suffering that have been out there. But has it always been good? Absolutely not. But I think it's really interesting to think about these things and be able to step back. And I think that's why, your program, Conversations with History, is exactly the kind of thing we need, which is we have to be able to look back, not just over the past year or two, but really over hundreds or thousands of years, and understand where have we come from? How have these prior technologies affected our culture? And so that will help us to understand how the current technologies are going to help us in the future.
So how would you advise students to prepare for the future? I think I hear you saying that, even for engineers, art is important, philosophy may be very important, and actually subcultures are very important. The kind of traditions you come out of, either religion or nationality or so on.
Well, I have to be careful. I think probably 10 years ago I was much more, I had this idea that I could, lead the engineers to appreciating art. And in some sense, I've become more realistic. I think that I really understand that there's a deep, really difference in temperament. And so that there's many engineers who just, that's not for them. And I'm not in favor of forcing it down anyone's throat, whether it's art, philosophy, or on the other side, many people in the humanities don't want to really encounter engineering and its technological, culture. So I think that part of what is possible, though, is being at least giving these things the benefit of the doubt. And that's where I do see we have work to do. I think that as professors, we can set an example of being open and respectful of the cultures outside of our own. And I mean this in, for example, how engineers can be careful not to disparage humanists or artists when they're teaching, and vice versa. And I think that's something, for example, here on this campus, we do very well. I think that these new interdisciplinary centers, like the Berkeley Center for New Media, the Citrus program, these are new initiatives that are bringing people together that previously didn't talk. And I think that there's a huge potential there.
Mm-hmm. And what are the biggest obstacles to transcending the disciplines and reach this broader collaboration? You suggested a moment ago that in part it may be a matter of temperament.
Yeah.
But is it also a matter of exposing the other side, whatever that other side is, to different ways of thinking and different curricula?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's ultimately it's fear, right? I mean, it's kind of xenophobia, where, it may not be about, another country, but it's about another way of thinking. So the engineers might have a xenophobia an engineer might have a xenophobia towards someone from the English department, and vice versa, right? So that's where I think just bringing in a degree of good old-fashioned respect is very important. And I think the culture that's evolved over many years at Berkeley as an example of this. And I can't pinpoint where it started, and I certainly don't think it was something that came out in the last 20 or 30 years. It's really been around for a long time. But it's an idea that when you're sitting down in the faculty club or you come across the campus, you see someone else, and there's a presumption that they're doing something interesting. And that's the kind of thing I think we need to also convey to our students.
Mm-hmm. And in the end, it's the kind of thing that a public institution like Berkeley, with its tradition, can do best.
Absolutely, and I think this is actually a great point, which is, so much of the news has been dominated by the budget cuts and the increases in tuition, and I think for many people outside the campus, they feel, I've heard people say, boy, how are you managing? How can you survive this situation? It's so terrible. But as you know, actually within the campus, it's remarkable, it's flourishing. I mean, the environment here is pretty much unchanged in so many ways. And so what I think we need to do is to convey that to the public, to show that the campus is still this wonderful haven for people to start to communicate at all different levels, across disciplines, and really think about the future. And that's a wonderful, incredibly valuable resource, and one worthy of the support of the public.
On that note, Ken, I want to thank you very much for coming back on our program and for this fascinating discussion.
Thank you so much, Harry. It's always a pleasure.
And it was great to have you again. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.